This is episode 292 of the Manager Track podcast, and we're going to talk about performance versus potential, a better approach to assessing your people. Here are the two questions this podcast answers. 1, how do you successfully transition into your first official leadership role? And 2, how do you keep climbing that leadership ladder and continuously get promoted, although the competition and the expectations get bigger? This show, the Manager Track podcast, will provide the answers. I'm your host, Ramona Shaw. I'm on a mission to create workplaces where work is seen as a source of contribution, connection, and personal fulfillment. And this transition starts with developing a new generation of leaders who know how to lead so everyone wins and grows. In the show, you'll learn how to think, communicate, and act as a confident and competent leader you can be. Welcome to the Manager Track podcast. This is a packed episode. Packed because we're going to talk about a really important topic, especially at year end. But even if you're listening to this any other time of the year, this is going to be a lot more like a training lesson on performance reviews and talent evaluations. And this is not only coming from my personal experience, but also from talking to, I wanted to say, about 20 different HR leaders to better understand how they're thinking about these concepts, and then wrapping all that into this particular episode. So get ready for an insightful and practical episode that will help you either support the leaders in your organization better or lead your people better and start the new year with more momentum and clarity about the talent that you have and their potential and their development plans. So at year end, if you're a manager or you're responsible for building the systems that support managers, you already know what this means. There are strategy sessions, there are planning sessions, but there are also review sessions. It's performance conversations that take place, it's talent calibrations, and maybe it's even comp and salary and bonus discussions that are happening all at the same time. All these things will decide how people get paid, how they progress, and how clearly they understand where they stand. There's a lot at stake at this time, not only from how you see your people, but also how the people on your team or in your organization see leadership, how much trust they have, how much they believe that the story that you're telling them at year end, how true that is, how motivated they are moving forward and giving their best based on whether or not they felt they got rewarded for the effort in 2025 in this case. And so with that, there's a lot at stake on both sides. And something really important that I want to surface today is that a lot of leaders unintentionally kind of muddy the waters during that time. There are actually a number of different conversations that are happening, and we want to talk about 2 different conversations that happen at this year that we want to particularly focus on. 2 questions you need to answer about every person on your team. And what I meant with muddying the water is the fact that most leaders actually collapse them into kind of one messy, sometimes confusing process that ends up not really helping anyone. So let's look at these 2 questions. The first question is, how did this person perform this year? The second question is, what is this person's trajectory and how critical are they for what's ahead? And those are not the same things. When you blur them together, you make decisions that are actually harder to defend, harder to calibrate, and harder to communicate. So we have to separate them out, and what we're going to do in this episode is to look at each of them separately and discuss what actually matters in each of those conversations. So before we dive in, let me actually quickly clarify the 2 conversations a bit more. One is the performance review. They're about the last 12 months. They're about the person's current role, what they were accountable for, how they delivered on it, what outcomes they created, and how they showed up while doing all of this. This is ultimately the foundation for fair pay decisions, bonuses, and even potentially promotions. Talent assessments are different. They're about potential adaptability, and future roles. So they look 1 to 3 years out. They're about whether this person can grow in the ways that the business will need and whether they elevate others along the way. It could also be whether they're shaping the culture in a meaningful way, whether they can stretch into bigger responsibilities, maybe as the company is going to enter a hypergrowth phase. These two conversations connect, but they're not interchangeable. And the connecting piece is agility. High performance in the current role without the agility to pivot, to learn, or to stretch does not equal high potential. You need both conversations because one gives you fairness and clarity in the present, while the other one gives you preparedness for the future. Two different things. If you skip the performance reviews, people don't know where they stand. If you skip the talent assessments, you end up scrambling as the business takes off or changes course. You might have a hard time filling open roles or don't know what to do when a key person leaves. If you blur them together, then bias creeps in and it actually makes it more confusing to you, likely, and everyone around you. Now, with all that said, of course, the most important part is that these conversations are not just conversations for the sake of it or end in some kind of document with check boxes on it. The main goal of all of it is action and implementation. So the performance reviews in itself, they must trigger compensation or improvement plans. Talent discussions must trigger development opportunities, succession strategies, or retention moves. When the process produces no action on either side, people stop believing in it and they won't invest in the process. They won't give you the information that you need, whether you're collecting qualitative or quantitative data. And the further up that you go, meaning once you have managers that report into you or multiple layers of management that report into you, if your demands for them to, especially at year end, when a lot of it comes together, if you're demanding them to invest in either of those processes and they don't actually lead to a payoff, like a meaningful reward or return on that investment down the road, it will turn into a performative action or initiative every year. And most of us have probably been in some kind of company or situation where some of these year-end processes seemed a bit performative and we didn't quite know why we're doing what we're doing or how it all rolls up to the top. And it's not to say that they actually weren't meaningful. It may also just be that we didn't quite understand why we're doing this, why this information is needed, what all the hours that you spend on the performance reviews, your team spends on it, what it's all for and whether or not it's worth it. So speaking of not quite understanding what all this is for, let's talk about the different tools because sometimes they may seem a bit bureaucratic or just admin work. Systems sometimes are really clunky, but as a leader, it's really important that you understand what these systems are designed to do and what the intention is of the process. Without any of these tools, both compensation and sort of promotion cycles and succession plans and all that can really quickly become inconsistent. We see favoritism play into it, recency bias playing into it, and employees will leave because they're unclear of the expectation and don't know how to succeed. Or they get demotivated because they think they know how to succeed, only to then find out that actually someone else who seemed to have done way less than them is getting the promotion and they don't. So a well-designed framework around performance and a different framework around talent evaluations gives organizations a shared language for what good work actually looks like. And it reduces the influence of personal preference. It connects the daily tasks to the broader strategies, and it ensures that decisions can be explained, defended, and repeated across teams. We really want to avoid that our decisions as leaders or as organizations come across as biased or based on gut instincts, especially when it comes to big things such as promotions, pay, or future opportunities. one of the things in terms of creating consistency that we talk about here on the podcast, but also in the work that we do at Arcova, is creating leadership charters to ensure that the leadership values and the principles that we want to instill in the organization aren't getting diluted because we're hiring people from different organizations, they're joining our leadership team, and suddenly all these leaders have different expectations, different ideas of what good leadership looks like. They have different principles, different routines. Let's say the most obvious one, whether or not the leaders have one-on-one meetings and how often they have them, how they give feedback, if they have team meetings or not. Every leader may do this differently if there aren't clear guidelines of what good leadership looks like. And just like we proactively want to set the tone for that through a leadership charter where we make these things explicit, the way we want to assess talent and review performance should equally be coordinated and created some kind of consistency so that people in one team aren't getting all the bonuses and salary bumps and people on another team are getting nothing just because of how the leader might feel or how the leader thinks they need to motivate the team or reward the team for that matter. Now, with the frameworks, even the best frameworks can break down if leaders don't use it the way it's intended. That's where typically things get messy. Many models look great in theory, but they do fall apart once the realities of people, biases, time pressure, and even manager capabilities and competences start to interact with those frameworks. And this is something that came up often when speaking to HR leaders, that yes, this framework is good, or I've used to use this type of framework, but over the years, I found that it breaks down every time we use it because the data quality, the input that goes into the systems or the way that the leaders engage with them just doesn't quite pan out the way that this framework was intended, that interaction to happen or that data quality to be. So theory is all great. Practice is really where we want to pay attention to. So I'm not just looking at this from an academic point of view. I want to give you the tactical and practical insights today. So instead of pretending that all these frameworks are the plug and play systems or coming at it very academically, I'm going to talk about what actually works and the points where things tend to break down so that you're informed and you can be prepared. Okay, let's look at the key frameworks. First, let's talk about goals and achievement models. Those work beautifully when goals stay relevant and ambitious. The problem is that priorities shift. And goals don't always shift with them, which can quickly lead to having to retrofit at year end. And I remember vividly writing my own performance review or my own self-reflection at some point, looking at the goals I set in January and then what I actually did that year, and I realized there's not a whole lot that's matching up. The reason for this is that by March, priorities have changed. By June, an opportunity for a project was presented to me. So with the agreement of my boss and my boss's boss, I was reassigned to a different project. And so the goals all needed to change. So if then you get to this point where at year end, you have to rewrite goals to match what actually happened, you can see how that's going to start to seem a bit useless. It can also be that people start to sandbag at the start of the year because they've learned the system rewards caution more than ambition. So to make this model work, goals have to be revisited and adjusted throughout the year. Not just doing this exercise, right, in December. So that's the thing with the goals and achievements models. Now we're talking about the actual performance here to clarify that. A second model that's frequently used is the competency model. This can be powerful, it's simple, it's often memorable and tied directly to the behavior that truly matter for the business. This would be when we say, here are the competencies that we want to hone in on. It might be we're going to really focus on quality this year, or we're going to really focus on cost saving, or an efficiency? Or are we going to pay attention to growth? Or are we going to focus on customer satisfaction? It could also be like a leadership behavior where you might say, we need to engage in professional development, up-leveling our team, or becoming more resilient. And then at year end, leaders get measured on how well they demonstrated this particular competence. This often, by the way, involves 360 assessments or reviews where not only obviously the leader and the leader's boss, but a whole bunch of other people will rate them on these competencies. The challenge is that when organizations add too many competencies or create different sets for different functions, people stop reading them, paying attention to them throughout the year because it just seems too much and no longer relevant. And then at year end, people will look at this and say, I don't know, you were like a 4 out of a 5, so I'm gonna just justify it with this competency model, but not really because I understood the competency or because I was all year long paying attention to how well you demonstrate that competency. Like any model, if a model tries to measure everything, it ends up measuring nothing. So for a competency model to work, we have to tighten the number of competencies we're assessing. And then we also have to make it really clear on what type of behaviors, what do we see in employees when they demonstrate this competency. And the more clear that is and the tighter those definitions, the better those frameworks work. Now let's talk about rating systems. You've probably seen the 1 to 5 ratings, but these rating systems only work when people know what the ratings mean and everyone in the organization understands what type of behavior, what type of performance to rate with what number. I want to give you an example here. I talked to an HR leader named Charles Thompson, and he just completely redesigned the company's rating system. When he first came into the organization, he talked to every single employee. And what he heard over and over was that the review process seemed to take a lot of time and serve no purpose. It took them about 2 hours per person to complete the entire process, and people just kept saying that they didn't get much out of it. It seemed for many a box-checking activity. So he decided to blow the whole thing up, to redesign it from scratch. And one of the important things that he did was to redefine what the different numbers from 1 to 5, what they actually meant. So a 2 doesn't automatically mean that someone is failing. Typically, right, when we say, okay, 1 to 5, a 3 is you're doing okay, a 2 is you're definitely underperforming, a 1 is you're about to get fired. But it could also mean, but in Charles' case, he actually decided, no, wait, a 2 could mean you just stepped into a new role and you're still developing to get up to speed. He, in essence, separated developing from needs a performance plan, right? So we're still growing and learning, which is totally okay and often exactly what is expected. And that is different than someone who should be performing higher but is currently lagging behind. Those are two very different things. And so we have to clarify, what do these different ratings mean for all of us, but also how to apply them given an employee's life cycle and performance cycle in the organization. It's a really important and critical distinction. So a 3 typically means meeting expectations, meaning you are completely up to par and up to speed on your job and you're doing what you're supposed to be doing. Oftentimes, when someone is doing what they're supposed to be doing, we're rating them above a 3. In most organizations, they would probably get a 4. Charles decided, no, wait, that's actually not helpful. If you're looking at a bell curve, right, where we want to have the majority of people actually, they're doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. And then there's some that are probably not the right fit for the role or for the organization. And then there are some that are truly outstanding. They're performing above what is expected. So he reframed the 4 and the 5, and he replaced what often is labeled as exceptional at the 5 to say, no, The 4 is exceptional, right? They're doing way more than they're supposed to, or they're doing it way better. 5 is actually transformative. And that is something that I want to highlight here because I thought it was a brilliant reframe. Transformative means when we want to assess someone as being transformative, we actually have to answer the question, what did they do that transformed the organization? And if we can't think of an example of what they did that really had transformative impact on their team, the department, or the org at large, then they're probably not supposed to have a 5. It's likely not many people, and it's likely not many people many years over and over. You might do something really transformative this year, but then not much next year. And then maybe you're working on a bigger project that launches in 2027, and that is when you're having transformative impact. So really the questions to hone in on are, what did this person do that actually transformed the organization? How did they make a difference? What did they leave behind? What's their legacy they're building? And who and how many people did they positively impact? So it shifts this conversation from the exceptional, are they better than others? Are they doing a little more than just more than others? From the 3 to 4 to the 5, to know, wait a second, what was actually the impact that they had? So when we're looking at those scaling questions, the first thing is to really, so when we look at those scaling questions, it's really important that we have really clear understanding what each of those means and that they're meaningful. In Charles' case, they decided that, okay, if we want to cut down on the time invested in the performance reviews, and let's really look at giving solid and useful feedback and have good, strong development plans for the vast majority of the people, like at the bell curve, people that are about a 3. Let's definitely address the people who are at a 1 or a 2 to decide what do we need to do. Maybe if they're at a 2, no, it's just because they're moving into and growing into their role, that's fine. Let's see if they need any support. But otherwise, let's play this out. For those who are at a 1 or where they're actually underperforming, let's have conversations on what to do next. So we want to spend some time there to find solutions and get those resolved. And then we want to also figure out what we're going to do with people at the 4 and the 5. And in order to avoid having everyone rate everyone else at a 4 and 5, which is what typically happens, and then you have all these people sort of at the tail end of it, Charles requested that if you give someone a 4 or 5, you have to reason it. You have to give a rationale. You have to explain yourself, and you have to actually fill out more questions. So when you give someone a 4 or when you give someone a 4 or 5, you have to actually justify that. So the incentive is now to not give someone a 4 or 5, because if you're really busy, you'd rather probably not spend a lot more time on the performance review or more than you need to. And so you won't give them 4s or 5s unless you actually mean it, unless this person actually deserves a 4 or 5, in which case we're happy, like leaders are happy to put in the time because they know these are really important people to keep on the team, to reward appropriately and to incentivize. And so with the 4 and 5, we then have to justify this rating. And in that case, we're also going to look at what's the development plan, how can we continue to nurture and support them going forward. So those were the rating scales, which in addition to the competency model and the goals and achievement model, those are all focused on the actual performance aspect of it. Now, many times, by the way, in addition to the rating modules, organizations ask a set of open-ended questions, such as, what went well, what didn't go well, and what will you do differently next year? Or what went well, what didn't go well, and how did you demonstrate our 5 company values? These are open-ended questions that many times employees will answer themselves, and then their leaders or even other people that they work with will answer for them, so that we have a broader and a bigger group of people sharing feedback on their performance. So those again were the common performance review models, and the things that, especially as leaders, if you're not too involved with the HR process or you're new to this, you should understand what are the different methods to evaluate performance and what are ways to think about how you want to do this. Yes, Oftentimes, HR drives a lot of this, but it doesn't mean that you don't have any influence or control over how you're going to run this for your team. If you feel like something is missing or you feel something else might be more appropriate for your team, figure out together with HR how you can make this work best for your team so that your time invested, but also their time invested, doesn't seem like a waste. Okay, now let's look at what are some talent review frameworks. And what was interesting when I went into this is that I was most familiar with the 9-box model. And so I thought, let me look at other models that HR leaders might have developed themselves or that organizations apply. And what I thought was interesting in talking to numerous of those HR leaders was that actually many of them, the vast majority, use 9-box modules or a sort of an iteration of a 9-box model. Now, I want to quickly explain what a 9-box model or assessment is. It looks at the talent from two different angles. It's performance on one axis and potential on the other axis. And those two are now important distinction. When someone performs really well, but they don't have a lot of potential, they're likely good at where the company is now, but they may not grow with the organization. And that's important to know. It could also be that someone has great potential, but they're not performing well yet. And those people will be good for the future, but they may need additional support in order to up-level their performance. Now, if performance is great and potential is great, those are obviously the winners. If performance is low and potential is low, then we know there's likely a more serious conversation that we need to have, because they're either in the wrong role or in the wrong organization overall. In the 9-box model, by the way, in terms of performance and potential, we have to really get clear on what do we mean with performance and what do we mean with potential? What are the different aspects that we are assessing to determine if someone has potential? If we leave this unspoken or unclear, if you have 5 people in the room, 5 different leaders, you're going to end up with 5 different interpretations and ways to measure performance versus potential. So with those models, with a 9-box model or some iteration of that, these types of assessments are only as good as the calibration behind them are. Without the calibration, leaders may have very different ways to assess their leaders. They may also hoard talent, meaning they will give them high performance ratings, but not high potential ratings, so that they won't leave, because the high potential people are often the ones that are identified as people to move into bigger roles or new responsibilities. It could also be that leaders will inflate the ratings for people that they're personally close to. So someone that they really like or really enjoy working with, they may be biased and give them a higher potential rating. Because again, if performance is really KPI oriented, goal oriented, like an OKR goal framework, we can all see, did they hit the target or did they not? Did they close X amount of sales? Did they write this much code? Or did they launch these different return metrics or targets? With potential is now, again, a lot more subjective. So we have to be really clear, and then we have to clarify to avoid those biases. Leaders need to come in with evidence, with clear patterns and understanding of the behaviors in which the potential is grounded, not just ambition or personality. And this is where it gets tricky. But if you want to use a 9-box module to assess your team, before you even go into this, spend a good amount of time looking at how you measure performance, and then more importantly, how you're going to measure potential. And what actually lets you know if someone has the potential to really grow with the organization. I worked with a client this year. They were a smaller startup and they were bought by a big enterprise. And they knew that over the next 2 years, there's going to be a lot of change in the organization. That company's going to come in, they're going to change the HR system, they're going to change the tech stack, they're going to change the values of the organization. So there's going to be a lot more bureaucracy that's going to flow into the day-to-day work. And they needed to know who on their team is going to be okay with the change who's going to be resilient, because there are going to be a lot of sort of trial and error runs, a lot of hard conversations, but also who's going to want to work in an organization like this, who has the potential to thrive in a somewhat startup environment, but inside a larger enterprise. Some people have great strength and they do really well, but they're not going to work well inside that environment of a small organization, a small team. So what you consider to be potential could be based on the circumstances, based on the growth, based on market dynamics, based on values or goals or targets that you set for the organization or for your team specifically. And then what are the skills, but also the mindsets, the behaviors and personal competencies that you need to see in the people that have the biggest potential to be thriving in the future, in that ideal state that you're aiming towards. Another module to look at potential is the skill will matrix. The skill will matrix will look at the employees and rate them based on their skill and the level of skill that they demonstrate versus their will. Like, how motivated are they? So someone with high will and high skill is both highly competent as well as highly engaged and motivated, and vice versa. Now, the hard part with the skill will is that it's really hard to assess. What are the different skills we're looking at and how clear are we on those? And then two, how do we determine if someone is motivated? How do we determine if someone has a will? And actually, if they're doing a good job, they're skilled and they're performing, how much do we actually care about their will? If they show up and they perform just fine, and we might just feel like they're not as enthusiastic as I wish them to be, or they're not working late hours, that might just be a personal choice, but it's not have much to do with how motivated they are or how engaged they are. They may just have different professional or personal boundaries than the person assessing. So there is a lot of risk that goes into skill will, but it's a framework that people use to assess potential in the future. Now, one of the developments or trends that we're seeing is that many HR teams are looking for ways to still have those performance conversations and talent conversations, and to assess based on this what development plans are necessary, what goals are important for employees to define, who should be joining what kind of development team, succession planning conversations, comps, and all that. Have that, and maybe have that twice a year or quarterly or at year end, but have a lot more touch points and moments of data collection throughout the year. So this then speaks to the project-based feedback collection. Every time that a project or a deliverable was submitted or completed, at that point, we're collecting data both from the employee themselves, but also from everyone else who was involved. And how can we automate this process, integrate it into the workflow day by day, week by week, so that at any given time we have both a record of how they're doing right now, but also an unbiased view of what they did 6 months ago. And what I mean unbiased, not impacted by the recency bias, because we can't remember what they did 6 months ago, but we do remember what they did over the last 4 weeks. And so giving a lot more weight to the last 4 weeks. When we have this ongoing feedback that's being tracked and we're collecting the data, we can then have a more accurate picture of their performance over time. And so speaking of biases, with those models, the different frameworks that we talked about, and I said this earlier, we want to reduce biases because biases show up everywhere, even when the framework is solid. And that recency bias is one of the biggest issues because, let's say, the last 4 to 6 weeks often overshadow the previous 11 months. I remember a leader who once told me, I go slow into the year and then I start to ramp up in August, September, because I know that's really what matters when it comes to the compensation and year-end conversation. So I really go hard August, September, and then I do well in my performance reviews. And so that's exactly what we want to avoid, both for the employee to think that and then adjust their level of engagement according to it, but also for leaders who really only do see the last couple of months at most, and then they ignore all the data from earlier in the year. There's also an idiosyncratic rater effect, and that is influential too when it comes to these types of conversations. It means that leaders rate people through their own lens, their own standards, and their own, let's say, comfort with conflict, their own biases about style, personality, or how they themselves were promoted. So a leader with extremely high expectations may rate everyone else low, versus a leader who avoids conflict and wants everyone to be happy and wants to be liked may rate everyone really high. A leader who identifies with someone's style, someone who might be really matter of fact or very analytical, may inflate that person's performance or potential without intending to. They don't see that, no, actually each style has its own strength, and it's important to find bringing people with different styles together in order to complement each other. But we assign greater weight and more benefits to the style that we resonate with the most. So the only way to counteract this is through the discipline. It's through evidence over impressions, patterns over the isolated moments, and it's calibrations with peers who actually are willing to challenge your own assessment. So when you determine your ratings as a leader, you have to ask yourself, is this rating something that I can defend with clear examples, or is this just a feeling? Biases really don't disappear just because you're aware of it, but we can interrupt it. Even people who study and write papers on biases, they still have biases. This is how our brains are wired. But when we're aware, we can interrupt them, course correct them, and we can use frameworks to help us prevent some of these biases to flow into our decision making. So the most effective systems combine the clarity of goals, the behavioral depth of the values and principles that we set, as well as the competencies to get really clear of what those are and what those look like, and then the ongoing conversations, feedback conversations, and the more regular or more formal checkpoints. It's like the OKRs or the KPIs or the clear goals that give you the what, the values and the behaviors, then give you the how, and then the continuous dialogue that keeps surprises from building up. The formal check-ins are then often just used to ensure the fairness, the consistency, that type of collaboration, and to document things. Ultimately, it's not about making the system perfect. It is about creating enough structure to support fairness and consistency and clarity, while also keeping it flexible enough to adapt when the reality, like the goals, actually shift. Now, a quick word in case you're preparing for reviews right now. So first of all, if you prepare for your own review, we recorded a podcast episode on that, which we'll link in the show notes just recently. But if you're preparing to go into the performance reviews with your employees, make sure that you start with evidence. So you bring real examples, both to the performance review conversations or the calibration conversations, real sort of moments, real decisions, real outcomes. Don't rely on phrases or communicate things such as they are a strong communicator or they're a great collaborator. Get really specific about what changed because of their work and the impact that they had. And by the way, help your people prepare this way too. Many employees don't really know how to impact or how to articulate their impact. And they may need some prompt or an example, like a template on how they should reflect on the year, what kind of questions they should ask themselves, and how they should present this to you. If you don't do this and you just tell them like, hey, prepare for the conversation or send me your self-assessment, and let's say you have 7 people on the team, it's very likely that you receive 7 documents with all of them varying degrees of depth and length. And some of them you might look at and you think, okay, I don't know what to do with that. And so to avoid that type of situation, give them as much clarity up front of what is expected. And then of course, like we've talked about here, separate the performance from the potential, even if that conversation happens in the same meeting. So make sure that you're talking about performance on one hand, and then separately to that, and you want to distinguish the two, you talk about potential. Also, just as recapping here, don't let likability inflate a rating. Don't let personality, let's say, overshadow contribution. use values as criteria and how these values are being demonstrated, and hold the line on the ratings. Get really clear on if you use the 1 to 5 or 1 to 10, what these different ratings mean, and be consistent with those and really clear in the explanation or definition. When we inflate those ratings, we're actually hurting the credibility of the system, and we make overall calibration and sort of plan of action based on the ratings much harder. And then last but not least, avoid surprises. So if someone hears something in their review that they haven't heard during the year, it's not a system problem, it's a leadership problem. So make sure that doesn't happen. And then when you do go into a calibration conversation with your peers, go in ready to defend your decisions with clarity and with confidence. Your team members and your peers deserve that level of preparation, because the calibration is really meant to ensure consistency and somewhat of an objective view on how someone gets rewarded, possibly promoted, and the plan of actions, and to make sure that across the team there's some increased fairness as a result of the calibration. Now, when we look at overall trends, where are these types of conversations headed? Many companies are shifting their performance systems. So more companies are separating ratings actually from the compensation. They're also simplifying models, and many of them are trying to gather feedback in real time, including their peer perspectives and a range of different stakeholders, as well as incorporating AI technology to flag rating patterns that might signal biases and to place a heavier emphasis on impact instead of effort. So what's really important is that both the performance reviews and the talent reviews are not paperwork exercises, but they are leadership tools. And they reveal how you think about your people, how you make decisions, how seriously you take fairness, and how intentionally you build the kind of team the future in your team in the future really requires. Of course, the models don't really do the work for you. You have to make the system work by being really rigorous in your approach, being really intentional with setting up the different definitions that you use, collecting evidence, not just now, but throughout the year, being really honest, and then disciplined with the process. With all that said, as you step into the review season, if you look at this really as an opportunity to lead at a higher level, to be strategic with your approach, you use those frameworks effectively, and to prepare and to be proactive and thoughtful about your decision making. Challenge your own biases, like demonstrate that you are trying to be as objective as possible, that you have rigor in your decision making. Come to these conversations with that sense of clarity. And then really use the process also to build some momentum for the next year. How you want to develop the team, where you see it going, what kind of skills or competencies you need to cultivate and really develop further based on what's ahead and the strategic goals that your organization may have, or how you see the market or the industry in what direction that you're moving. So you're not just evaluating the year that we've just closed, but you are already starting to shape the year ahead. And that concludes this episode on this deep dive on performance reviews and talent reviews. I hope you found this insightful, you took notes. If you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I want to thank all of the different HR leaders that have participated in the conversations around performance tools, shared their take on it, their concerns with it, and their plans for 2026. That informed a big part of this episode as well. So thanks to everyone who contributed, and thanks to you for listening all the way to the end. It demonstrates your care and your intention to do a good job with those conversations and with supporting your team in the new year. I'll see you next week with another episode of the Manager Track podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, then check out 2 other awesome resources to help you become a leader people love to work with. This includes a free masterclass on how to successfully lead as a new manager. Check it out at arcova.org/masterclass. The second resource is my best-selling book, The Confident and Competent New Manager: How to Quickly Rise to Success in Your First Leadership Role. Check it out at arcova.org/books, or head on over to Amazon and grab your copy there. You can find all those links in the show notes down below.